welcome to the Frontline Club, and thank you for coming tonight. It's a pleasure to have Christina Lamb here talking about her new book, Kabul. And if you haven't got a copy already, there are lots of them on sale, and I'm sure she will stay around to sign it for you. In a moment, I'm going to hand you over to Sarah Montague, the presenter of BBC Radio 4's Today programme, who's going to chair tonight's conversation. Before I do that, just a couple of house rules. Firstly, if you can to silent, and secondly, we are filming tonight's event, so when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone. So over to Sarah.
Thank you very much, Millicent. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Now, for an audience at the Frontline Club, Christina Lamb really doesn't need an introduction. I mean, goodness knows she's known around the country, she's known around the world for her reporting over 27 years. Based in Pakistan, Afghanistan, the UK, Washington. She even, of course, went to Guantanamo in that time. She has, perhaps more than any other Western journalist, seen and reported from all sides, of course, of what became such a long conflict for America and Britain. And it's that sweep of reporting which goes into this book. And Christina, and just so you know, there'll be a chance for questions, obviously. I'm going to hog it for a while before I come out. We'll be all done by 8:30, but there is obviously, given the nature of the subject, so much ground that it would be nice to cover. But Christina, going back, I know you went back through your notebooks of 27 years. Now, these are stories that obviously you're familiar with. You've written about just after they happened. And I was just struck what it must be like to revisit things that presumably you thought you knew, but with this perspective, looking back on it, must have been a strange experience.
Yeah, it was. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. And I was just saying to Sarah on the way in around the corner, I don't know if others of you passed lots of people camping with Union Jacks, and I'd completely forgotten about the royal baby. So,
they should have been camping to hear you.
So anyway, all of these notebooks, my house for the last year has just had piles of notebooks for every year going back to 87. I managed to keep all my notebooks except for one, which I lost in a trench in Helmand.
As you do.
But it's kind of weird going back to, you interview people who at the time you have no idea what is going to happen to them. So Hamid Karzai, who I first met in 87 as a spokesperson for really the smallest of the 7 Mujahideen groups fighting the Russians, of course never imagined that he would end up being president of Afghanistan. But more sobering is some of the things that people say to you. So, I talked to people a lot back in 87, 88 when I was first in Peshawar, living there, about the Arabs fighting in Afghanistan. Now, I'd like to be able to say that when I went back through my notebook, I found an interview with Osama bin Laden, but not. But, I talked to people a lot because the Afghans were really quite uneasy about all these Arabs that had come to fight with them against the Russians, and lots of Americans that I spoke to at the time who really encouraged the whole thing and said it was great that all these Arabs had come, and the more that came the better. Never, of course, did we think about what that meant after the Russians had left. And I interviewed in 89, just after the Russians had left Afghanistan, a man called General Hamid Gul, who is the Director General of Pakistan's ISI, military intelligence. And he said to me at the time, the West think they can use these Arabs as cannon fodder, and then just abandon them, but it will come back to haunt them. Now, I wrote that down, not thinking anything about what he meant, but of course, he was right, and 9/11 was a direct result of that.
Going back over them, I suppose particularly over the last 10, 15 years when you look at them, there must have been anger at the time when you were reporting on certain stories. When you went back and looked at them again, what was your feeling there? Was it one of, did you re-summon the anger, or was there, I was naive at the time and what I expected? What was the sort of personal feelings? Because you're somebody who is so immersed in it.
Yeah, so I was angry that I felt a lot of people I knew had been killed in this war, and wanted to try and make some sense of it, whether it really had achieved anything. And certainly, going back through the notebooks does make you realise how short-term a lot of the decisions are. And people were only thinking about what's happening at the time and not thinking about what the effect of that might be in the future. So whether it was encouraging a lot of bad people from different Arab countries to come and fight against the Russians, or whether it was later on, for example, in Iraq in 2003, interviewing some of Saddam's generals who had lost their job when the army was disbanded after Saddam fell. And they were very angry because they suddenly had no jobs. Now some of those people have ended up advising IS. So it does make you very aware that you can't just make these without thinking about the future. And I think that's one of the key things with Afghanistan. In Helmand, we had commanders there just for 6 months at a time in a country that's very complicated to understand. So how could you have long-term thinking?
Yeah, but the book starts, and you write of the being in Kabul, Christmas 2001, when it was an optimistic place, and you were optimistic.
I was. It's funny because a lot of the stuff that I write about is quite negative, and it was nice to actually, after the Taliban had fallen, I think we forget now, but in December 2001 the Taliban had been removed within 60 days, and everybody was saying this was a sort of model for international intervention. It had not cost very much money. It had cost $3.8 billion. 5 Americans had been killed in the process. 3 of those were in an American bomb, actually. So it was with little loss of life, not that much money, and using Afghans fighting on the ground. There was more loss of life of the Afghan Northern Alliance soldiers. But to the West, it seemed like a kind of economic way to intervene, and people talked about having discovered the philosopher's stone of intervention, and this was how to do things. So at that time, for a long while, after 9/11, we'd all been writing stories in Afghanistan about all the terrible things that the Taliban had done. And then once they removed, we were then all interviewing women who were casting off their burqas, supposedly, and men shaving off their beards, and and kids coming out to play with kites, which had been banned. So it was lots of positive stories, and it was fun being there, and all the journalists that were there at the time, we were kind of enjoyed writing what was happening.
And now, 14 years on,
Yeah.
you've described how the West has lost Afghanistan. Is Afghanistan lost? I mean, how are your feelings about what happens now?
I think it can go either way. I think that there are, obviously there's a lot of positive things. There's lots more children at school in Afghanistan than there were at the time of 9/11. Me that when people try and justify the war in Afghanistan, they often mention mobile phones, that there are 19 million mobile phones now in Afghanistan. I don't think anybody felt that we were fighting this war in order to spread mobile phone technology and help Vodafone. But actually, it does have a point in that when I went to Afghanistan back in the late 80s after the Russians had withdrawn, Afghanistan was completely cut off from the rest of the world. Even to make a phone call, you had to go through Pakistan. People had no idea what was going on outside. So now, with so many people, even in really remote places, you find people with mobile phones and people on Facebook in remote villages. That actually that does make a difference because they see what people are doing outside. They can see that there is an alternative to the way that they might be living, and they want that. So I think that is all positive. And Afghanistan's a very young population, 70% of the population's under 30. But there are a lot of negatives, which, for example, the Taliban haven't gone away, they have not been defeated, they haven't succeeded, they haven't captured Kabul, and I don't think they're about to capture Kabul, but they're still very active. They just launched the traditional fighting on Friday, and with lots of attacks around the country. And they certainly in a position to cause a lot of problems still. And I think they, will take parts of the country in the south and east, and so it's a mess, really. And I think you'll go back really to what Afghanistan used to be, where the central control the outside. But why I get angry about it is less about Afghanistan, actually, although there are certain specifics which we can go into, like women, for example, where I do, but is Pakistan, because we have left Pakistan much more unstable country than it was, and that's much more of a threat to the West, because it's a big country, almost 200 million people. It has 200 nuclear weapons, more than Britain has, and lots of militias and militant groups, and lots of armed people, and also there's a big Pakistani population here, people going back and forth. So I think that leaving that a much more unstable country is very dangerous.
You describe it as an even greater threat festering in Pakistan. Festering, I mean, with what result? Because after the attack on the school in Peshawar, there were a lot of people saying, look, this is a turning point. You obviously...
when I'm obviously very involved with Malala, because I wrote the book with her, and when she was shot, people said, this is a turning point and everything's going to change. And it didn't. In fact, many people you speak to in Pakistan will say Malala is a Western agent, a puppet, and accuse her of a lot of things. So again, with what happened in Peshawar, with the killings of the school, 132 children being massacred, I mean, it was so unbelievably horrible. And yes, afterwards, lots of officials said we are no longer going to make this kind of difference that we have in the past between good and bad Taliban, and now we're going to go after everybody. And Pakistan's army chief came to Britain a few months ago and said the same thing. But if you look at what's actually happened on the ground, nothing has changed. In fact, they recently released the mastermind of the Mumbai massacre. The people who run these different militant groups are all still free, wandering around, giving talks, even appearing on television, commentating about things. So it's very hard to see that anything has actually changed. You can't just say we've changed policy and do nothing.
Okay, so if you go back to your optimism at the end of 2001, and given what you now understand from and what you've seen, is there a way that it could have been done, both in policy towards Afghanistan and Pakistan?
Well, I think right from the start, we didn't listen to Afghan people. There was this focus on gender rights because the Taliban had repressed women, and a lot of consultants came in, and sorry, some of them probably here, but being paid lots of money. And I talked to Afghans at the time about what they thought that should be done, and what they cared about was feeding their children, security. They just wanted peace, really. Nobody ever said to me, what we really need is an election. And yet the West sort of obsession quickly was, we've got to have a constitution, we've got to have elections, we've got to have a elected government.
But that was to an end, wasn't it? I mean, that was the belief was that they could secure the peace and provide those things for the population via
The problem
elections.
was that first, I don't agree that that was the thing that was needed early on. And secondly, that allowed to stand for election a whole lot of people, warlords, who were the very people that most Afghans blamed for the situation in the first place. And I mean, we got in a contradictory situation where the CIA was giving huge amounts of money to warlords to supposedly help them track down bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, because that was the obsession at the beginning. And these people were the very people that had caused the problem that had led to the Taliban taking over, that had sort of been raping people and kidnapping people and running mini fiefdoms and setting up checkpoints and demanding bribes. So for ordinary Afghans to see those people suddenly empowered again and given jobs, becoming MPs, becoming ministers, becoming military commanders, sent a really contradictory message.
You said, I saw a warlord in Jalalabad receive a briefcase of CIA dollars in return for a list of his tribal enemies because he'd said they were Al-Qaeda.
Yes, he was delighted. I mean, he was given a huge amount of money. He gave a list to these American special forces, and then I got a lift from them from Jalalabad to Kabul afterwards. It was funny because they were very tooled up. They had lots of weapons, and normally I travel very low profile in sort of battered taxis and things. So I got in this car because they offered me a lift. I'd met them before, and when we started going, they said to me, how do you normally travel? So I told them, and they were a bit horrified. And then they said to me, well, you must feel much safer now. And I was sitting there thinking, I feel really unsafe with these guys. But they had literally given him a whole briefcase full of dollars and for this list, and he was laughing to me afterwards, saying that they were basically people, his rivals. And so I said to these Americans, how do you know that these people are actually bad guys? And I think they didn't really care. They wanted names to go and put in. There was this big computer at Bagram where they were keeping a big database of people. And lots of people were wrongly arrested and sent to Bagram or to Guantanamo even. And of course that then created great resentment too among them and their families and tribes.
And at various points, though, I mean, because you talk about the elections, there, over the years there was such effort put into whether it was local elections, the excitement when they had women voting. That was all for nothing, do you think?
Well, if you look at last year's election, for example, now, I was there for the first round of the election, and everybody was like, this is a great success because lots of people have come out and voted. And it was a great atmosphere in Kabul, anyway. But then after the second round, where then it all kind of disintegrated into these arguments over fraud and who had done more fraud than the other, and in the end, the election results were never released. A deal was done. So more than $200 million was spent on that election last year for an election in which the results were never released. It was just a deal. What was the point of that?
You describe in the book about a week you spent with Hamid Karzai, who you liked him, didn't you? I mean, you thought he was a rubbish president, but you liked him.
He's a very nice man. He's very funny and witty. He's very charming. And he's a Kandahari, and Kandaharis like to kind of laugh and tell jokes. So he has a very big laugh. But I was quite horrified when I spent a week in the palace. It was just so chaotic. At that time, these sort of reports of him being very erratic and very tempestuous hadn't emerged, but he just used to fly into rages over tiny things. So one day, he's very obsessed by the media, and one day the Kabul Times had a photograph on the front of him, and he said to me, "Look at this." And I said, "Oh, it's a nice picture." And he was like, "No, don't you see what's wrong with it?" And I was like, "Well, no, what's wrong with it?" And he said, "There's a fridge in the picture." And I was like, what's wrong with that? And he said, there's a picture of me next to a fridge. Why have they photographed me like that? And he just was furious about that. So there was, it was crazy, and people would turn up and just sit there in his office in the palace, who'd been promised jobs by various people. And so one day a man turned up and he said, I've come to be chief of staff. And I said, well, the president's got a chief of staff already. And he said, no, but I'm to be chief of staff now. I'm sure that the chief of staff doesn't know that because I'm dealing with him all the time. So this man said, no, it's no problem, I'm just going to wait. And every day he came and he sat there with his newspaper and just sat from morning till night for a whole week. And in the end, they made him head of protocol because he didn't go away. And then one day I met a man, and he told me that he was the head of the National Archive, really old man from Uruzgan. And I asked him, well, can I see it? What's in it? And he was very vague about it. And then afterwards, Karzai's spokesman said to me, oh, he can't read. And I said, well, how can he be head of the archive if he can't? He's completely illiterate. And he was like, oh, well, he's a friend of Karzai's. And so it was constantly like that. It was just full of people who'd either bribed their way or who knew somebody. And so you did not get a sense that the country was really being run very effectively. What I would say, though, he was very good at sort of schmoozing with tribes. Every evening he would have these various tribal elders to dinner from different parts of the country, and he was very good at keeping the country together. There was a big possibility that it might not have stayed whole, and he did keep the country unified.
Because I was going to ask you, if they'd gone for somebody else, would there have been a better outcome? But
I think that he would have made a very good foreign minister. In my view, he was mostly chosen because he spoke good English, and so they could speak to him. And that didn't make him the right person to rule Afghanistan. And when I went to Kabul in December 2001, after he'd been chosen, and by the way, he wasn't chosen by the Bonn conference, they chose somebody else and then were made to vote again because the Americans said it's got to be a Pashtun. And by the way, here is one we've got who happens to be in Uruzgan, and we've got him on a satellite phone link so he can speak to you all. And then they almost killed him the following week with a was misdirected.
So do you think if the focus had been, even in 2001, less on Afghanistan and actually more on Pakistan, we would be looking at a different situation now? I'm just wondering what the focus on Pakistan could have been.
It's not so much that we should have gone to war against Pakistan. That would have been very difficult and probably. But it was naively believing Pakistan when Pakistan said that they were on the same side. I mean, if you go back to General Musharraf being told by the Americans, you're either with us or you're against us. He then, in his own memoir, writes how he wargamed the Americans as an adversary and realized that there was no way that Pakistan could take on the US as an enemy. I mean, that doesn't sound like the words of somebody that was particularly well disposed towards what America was doing. And then, right from the start, I think it was incredibly naive to believe just because Pakistan had said, or Musharraf had said, we will cooperate with you, that actually on the ground that would happen, because here was a country, a military intelligence ISI, that had helped create the Taliban in Afghanistan, had supported them for decades, had very relations with them, and those people who were actually carrying out the policy on the ground were not changed. They were the same people. So of course they kept their contacts and links. And I think we didn't understand too, Pakistan's very clever, and it had this sort of policy of hedging, of like, okay, well, we'll support the US because they're going to give us lots of money and we don't really have any option, but we'll also just keep these here because they might be useful if we need them, and we think the Americans are going to disappear anyway and get fed up with Afghanistan quite quickly, and then we'll be stuck still here next to Afghanistan, so we need to have our own insurance policy. So actually it completely made sense from their point of view what they were doing. But there were other things too that the Americans didn't, and the West in general didn't take into account. For example, there are really quite bad relations between Pakistan and Afghanistan. I mean, Afghanistan did not vote for Pakistan to be into the UN when Pakistan was created. It was one of the only countries that didn't vote. Many Afghans believe that northwest Pakistan should be part of Afghanistan as it used to be, so don't recognize the border with Pakistan. So there was a lot of kind of factors there. And lastly, and most importantly of all, the Americans were really not trusted by the Pakistanis. In fact, many in Pakistan's military had an extremely negative view of the US because they remembered how after the Russians had left Afghanistan and Pakistan had worked with the CIA very closely to help defeat them, that America just stopped supporting Pakistan and then said Pakistan has a nuclear program, nuclear weapon, which they had known for years and turned to, in fact, it helped, inadvertently anyway, helped finance. And now we suddenly care about that, and so we're not going to give you any aid anymore, and we're going to cut you off. And so for many Pakistanis, feel very angry about that, do not trust the Americans with some reason, and believed that the same thing was going to happen again, that they would be used and then they would be abandoned. So you can see why they play both ways.
Tell us about coming face to face with one of the ISI officers who were running the Taliban.
Well, because I'd been going so long to Afghanistan, I knew ISI had kept some of the same people running the program initially with the Mujahideen and then the Afghan Taliban for years. And actually one of these people, Colonel Imam, I had met after the Russians left. The first to try and capture a city was for a place called Jalalabad in southeast Afghanistan. And it was very much something that Pakistanis had pushed the Afghans to do, and they hadn't really wanted to do. And so they launched this attack, which was disastrous. And I was there, and Colonel Imam was there. He was Major Imam then. And one of the Afghans, Rahim Wardak, who went on to be defense chief, at that time was a commander, and he said to Imam, "Why have you, who've never won a war, dare to try and tell us, who have never lost a war, what to do?" So I had known him for a long time. Now, after there were a lot of reports that ISI was still supporting the Afghan Taliban after 9/11, and I was told that he was still very active, he was going in and out of Afghanistan. So for a long time I was trying to meet him, to no avail. And finally in 2009 he agreed to meet me. And it was very strange to actually sit and talk to him. And he was very open about what they'd done. Now, officially, he was retired by then. And that's kind of what ISI does, so that there's this element of deniability that the people actually running the program, whether it's militants fighting in Kashmir or whether it's the Afghan Taliban, are retired people. Some of them are running NGOs, which are fronts for what they're doing. So he met me in a hotel, the Pearl Continental in Rawalpindi, and he arrived very late. I thought he wasn't going to turn up. I waited almost an hour, and finally he arrived. And it was very strange, sort of sitting face to face with him, and he was very angry by then he was angry about the Americans, but he was also quite angry with Pakistan's government, that he felt that they weren't supporting anymore what he was doing, and that they were sort of trying to cut him and others loose. And he was absolutely convinced that the Taliban were defeated and that they would end up leaving. And he was right. The West did end up leaving.
The Taliban cannot be defeated. And would you agree with him?
I mean, it's different. I don't think they're going to take back the government, but I also don't think we're going to wipe out the Taliban. I think they're not going to be defeated in that way. Whether there's some deal done at the end, or whether they'll just be kind of nuisance makers in different parts of the country.
Can there be some deal done, some accommodation to...
You know, people have talked about this a lot, but nothing concrete has actually happened. There's been very few kind of meetings, and what meetings there have been sort of talks about talks. There's been no actual peace talks. And the Taliban is very divided about it. I mean, there are plenty of senior Taliban who feel that they have seen off the West, more or less. There's still 12,000 Western troops there. And that they should go for all-out military victory. There are other people, you know, actually we should get what we can out of this, and why don't we actually do a deal?
Well, of course, the Taliban now look like relatively benign when you think about what's, you know, the rise of Islamic State. And the reports, there have been reports of Islamic State, you know, making appearances in Afghanistan. Can you see them getting a foothold there at all?
I'm a little bit sceptical about these reports. I mean, obviously, given what's happened in Iraq, it's a big fear that, you know, you abandon Afghanistan and then they'll move in there. And clearly, ISIS, Daesh want to brand and would like to be everywhere. But if you think about what the Taliban represent in Afghanistan, it's been very much more of a nationalist movement. It was never part of the global jihad. There have never been attacks by Afghan Taliban outside of Afghanistan. Indeed, 11 was not Afghans. There's no Afghans involved in it. They just want to take back the government. And so I don't really see IS taking hold in the same way there. I think it's more likely to take hold in Pakistan, where there's much more global jihad movement feeling. And I think, you know, when there was this bomb in Jalalabad a week ago, and there were reports that it was IS, and partly because a particular person who used to be spokesman for the Taliban, or one group of Taliban, said that it was IS, and so people were just... But I think there are some disgruntled Taliban who feel that the Taliban might be selling out, who might then say we will become IS because it's something more impressive to them. But what's interesting is that the president of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, has sort of... I mean, when he came here for the London conference in December, he talked about the dangers of IS coming into Afghanistan. When the attack happened in Jalalabad, he said that it was IS. And now, whether that is him trying to sort of use that as a bogeyman and say, look, to the outside world, if you stop helping us, this is what's going to happen. Because I don't think that there is really the evidence to say that it is IS.
In all your travels there, I mean, you've got yourself into some very serious scrapes, which you've written and are quite well documented, but I just wonder about how safe you feel. Do you feel less safe travelling there now than you used to?
Yes, sadly. I never used to feel unsafe at all. Now, so there are whole parts that I would find very difficult to go to. Even Kabul, which always used to be this kind of bubble, in the last couple of years has become much less safe for foreigners anyway. I mean, we saw that sort of spate of attack last year with the Lebanese restaurant, the horrible massacre there, and then the Serena Hotel buffet, people being gunned down, guest houses being attacked. So there was a real feeling of fear. And actually, I mean, you'd go out, most of the restaurants closed, you know, and you'd go out somewhere and would be the only foreigners in the restaurant. And I had, there's a place called Flower Street Cafe, which used to be a favourite place to go for brunch on a Friday. And I was there last year after these attacks, and actually the manager came up to me, and I was with some Afghans, I was only a foreigner, and he came up to me and said, "Can you leave?" And I said, "Why? We're the only customers." And he said, "You're a foreigner and people will know that you're here and it's dangerous, and please go." So that's really shocking, because it was never like that.
Because I know in November you went back to the place that you were in in
Yes.
2001 when you were staying there. You went back, you passed it, didn't you, and spoke to...
Yes, I did. I stayed, I'm sure it's familiar to some people here, the Mustafa Hotel of Wais Faizi, who was this wonderful Afghan-American from New Jersey, former used car salesman, who we used to call the Fonz of Kabul, because he could kind of organize anything. He could find turkeys at Christmas, and he had a bar in his hotel which was behind this amazing big kind of safe door with a combination, and he had a barman with a tattoo across his neck of dotted lines which said "cut here," and a dancing bin Laden doll. And he was a real character. Now, I mean, sadly, the hotel, which was a kind of oasis back in 2001, because it was one of the few places, it was never comfortable. It had been, he had actually been turning it into a money exchange, and so it was like all these cubicles separated by glass. And then when 9/11 happened, and then the invasion, and suddenly all these foreigners came, they like turned it back into a hotel and just painted over the glass. And so you could hear everything in the next cubicle. So if you were next to someone who snored, it was quite bad, and it was freezing cold. But over the years after that, other places opened up, other guest houses that were more comfortable. And Wise used to complain because he was constantly asked for bribes for people in order to have electricity and hotel function, and he didn't think that he should pay those, which I admired, but also didn't really like staying in the hotel, which had no electricity when everywhere else. I mean, at some points it was like we were this sort of island of darkness in a sea of light. So I stopped staying there in the end, and I felt awful about it, because he used to call me his sister, and I said to him, "Why is, I have to work, I need electricity, and other places have internet." So he sadly committed suicide in 2006, which shows, what a toll this was taking on people. And I did go to the hotel after that, and then just in November when I was there last, actually it was my last day, and I'd gone to buy a pomegranate. Shall I read what? Because
yes,
it ends the book. I'd gone to buy a pomegranate to take home with me, and because somehow pomegranates from Afghanistan are different than pomegranates here. And I'll just read a little bit. "It was time for me to go home now, too. Before I left, I went to the bazaar to buy a dented pomegranate, and the shopkeeper charged me 100 Afghanis, more than £1, which we both knew was too much. Winter was coming, and it was turning cold, rain turning to sleet, and roads turning to mud. Traffic had come to a halt and was splattering in fits and starts. Suddenly I realised we were in Interior Ministry Road. Stop, I commanded the driver. I was not allowed to stop, that it was a dangerous place, but I was in foreign correspondent mode and was already out of the car. Round the corner was the Mustafa Hotel, and at its doorway was standing Shabuddin, the tall Uzbek guard, just as he had been when we were so happy to find the hotel in 2001. His face lit up in recognition. "How is everyone?" I asked. "Not good," he replied. We say the devil fell in Kabul when he was cast out of heaven." He told me that after the hotel's manager, Wais Faizi, died, his father died of grief. Then his brother Mustafa borrowed a lot of money from Northern Alliance people and could not repay it, so they came at night and put him in Pulicherki prison. The hotel had then been divided between creditors into 3 separate parts. Just one floor is owned by 14 different people, said Shahbudin. There's still a picture of you and Wise in his car upstairs. That was such a happy day. He always called you his sister. I asked him to take me to see the photograph, but Shahbudin shook his head. It's not like before. It's was staying. What about the pigeons, I asked. Wise had kept pigeons, which I didn't like. Are they still there in the courtyard? Yes, he replied. Only a few, as no one feeds them or people have TV now and Facebook instead of pigeons and kites. Round the corner I could see my driver was being moved on by the police and was gesturing angrily for me to come, but I didn't want to leave. You foreigners always just pass through, said Shahbudin. We don't know what will happen, but I am happier you came than if you had not. I felt happy and sad all at once. As the last US Commander, General Joseph Anderson, lowered the US flag in Kabul in December, he said, I don't know if I'm pessimistic or optimistic. Like him, I didn't know what would happen. It felt like that moment before the shadows expire, when the day is over, but no one knows what the night will bring.
Your turn now. Some questions from everybody. Marvellous. I've got a load more I was going to say, but there's obviously a load. Do we need to wait for the microphone, Millicent? We do, because we're recording it. And just a reminder, if you could say, oh, you are lovely, thank you.
Ewan Grant, former government law enforcement intelligence analyst, recently returned from Pakistan, where I was at the Wagah crossing point 2 days before the suicide bombing there, but I came back just before Peshawar, and I think your comments on the situation in Pakistan to a T, 100%. Question is relating to Afghanistan and the relatively optimistic views at Christmas 2001. When did you in the fraternity start to think things really weren't going to plan after that?
It's a good question. I mean, obviously a lot of people link what went wrong in Afghanistan with the war in Iraq, that the West got distracted by another war, and there's something to that. And I went to Afghanistan, but I went to Afghanistan just before, like literally I flew from Kabul to Kuwait, and I saw Karzai just before I left, and he said the world will forget us now. And, you know, that is true to an extent, but I think already there wasn't the commitment to Afghanistan. The US didn't want to be involved in nation building. The way that things were being done wasn't right. So it was already kind of clear it was not going so well. But I think it was 2005 really where I felt like actually this is really going badly, and by 2006 it was quite clear, because by then the Taliban had regrouped, because they basically, I mean, the Taliban took advantage of the war in Iraq to, well, attention was off, to regroup, to they'd been fundraising and training in Pakistan and could see a way back. So after that was when they really started coming back. By 2005, they were really quite active. 2006, which was the year that the British then went into Helmand, things were really clearly going in the wrong direction. Yet, strangely, I interviewed for the book General Bano, who was commander 2005 to 6, and he said to me, he left Afghanistan thinking it had been a success. And I was quite astonished, but he said he left there thinking, yeah, this is sorted out, you know, it's done.
And when we did what we did in 2006 and the way we went into Helmand, did you think then this is not the way to redress what is going on?
The way we went to Helmand, I mean, I should be honest that I, by then, was arguing, I ever spoke, like I'm sure I did here, arguing that the West in general should send more troops to Afghanistan, because I felt after this December 2001, I mean, one of the problems was there were 20,000 American troops went there under what was called Operation Enduring Freedom, who were looking for bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. They were not there to make Afghanistan a safe place. They had a completely different objective. Indeed, you could argue they made it less safe by some of their actions. The number of troops, and the Americans didn't want any peacekeeping troops at all. In the end, this ISAF, which was set up, the International Stabilization Assistance Force, was only 5,000 troops, and for a huge country, a bigger country, and 20 people, it was crazy. And they were not allowed outside Kabul for the first few years. So I was arguing very strongly, as Karzai was arguing to everybody he met, that they needed more troops and be able to go around the country, because it was very clear to anybody outside, like the Taliban and ISI, that there was no way actually protect themselves, so they took advantage of that. So I did feel more troops should go, but I didn't understand why we went to Helmand, because Helmand didn't seem to be a strategically important place at that time. The place secure was Kandahar, which was the second biggest city in Afghanistan and was the kind of capital of the Taliban, and so that's where British troops should have gone. But instead we went to Helmand, and Helmand is a very complicated place. It's lots of different sort of tribes, and we just became one more complicating factor, and it took us a long time to understand that.
And Sangin back in the control of the Taliban, is that inevitable?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes, it is inevitable. I mean, what is the Taliban in Helmand? This was the problem. It was, most of what was happening was, certainly in the early time, was not Taliban. It was different rival tribes, different drug, because Helmand is the biggest drug producing province, and we should mention the fact that one of the results of the 13 years in Afghanistan is that Afghanistan is the world's biggest narco state and had a record poppy harvest last year of 6,400 tons. So, which is not, I think, a result anybody would have put as a success.
Can you hear clearly enough at the back? I'm good, sorry. Yes, please, your question.
Christina, 2, 3, or maybe whatever, 4 years ago, warming up was someone called Julian Assange when he was releasing the so-called Afghan war diaries. Can you tell me from your perspective a bit about them, and maybe in particular just a tiny bit on, at that time, everyone against him was saying, oh, he's put huge amounts of lives at risk, all the people who are secretly helping the West against the Taliban will all be murdered. That little part in particular, but just from your perspective, Afghan war diaries, please tell me about them.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of revealed more about the number of civilian casualties that there. And that was something Karzai had always raised a lot with the Western military, that a lot of their attacks, a lot of the airstrikes were killing civilians, and that they were, when they went into villages and attacked, they were often acting on just one piece of intelligence, which could be like my warlord who was sort of getting at his enemies, and didn't necessarily mean that there was a Taliban commander in these villages. So, you know, that certainly, I mean, I didn't feel there was anything released in there that was a great revelation that we didn't know before. It was more kind of really substantiating that kind of thing. I did feel that they were could put at risk some of the people who'd given intelligence, because although the Guardian redacted names, so you could identify some of the people by sort of where they'd been. But to be honest, I'm not aware of anybody subsequently having something terrible happen to them as a result.
I think there's a gentleman at the back. If you could say your name.
Yeah, Angus McSwan. It seems kind of apt that we're sitting here almost 40 years to the day since the fall of Saigon, and look at the competing versions of Vietnam. One is that it was a noble cause, maybe badly fought, badly planned on political and tactical level, or it was completely wrong thing to do, immorally an immoral thing, and badly waged with lots of atrocities, etc., etc. So, in looking at Western American-led interventions, how do you think history is going to judge what the West has done in Afghanistan? Or do you think there's no comparison at all?
No, I think there is a comparison. I think that, I mean, one of the big problems with was that people didn't really know why we were there. You know, there was a reason at the beginning in reaction to 9/11 and to get rid of the Taliban regime. But afterwards, what were we doing? And why did we even fight the Taliban later on? You know, they weren't part of 9/11. So I think there was a lot of confusion. The narrative of why we were there, I think political leaders in the West never convincingly explained to publics back home why we were there, and certainly completely failed to explain to Afghans on the ground why we were there and what we were doing there. I mean, Helmand is a microcosm of that. People had no idea what the British were doing there. And just as an aside, I mean, one of the most hilarious things I've ever seen in my reporting career was a group of village elders in Afghanistan being shown a film which was made by the British to sort of explain what we're doing in Helmand, which was segments of a BBC nature programme done by Attenborough called Blue Planet, which had whales and dolphins. Now, Helmand, is in the middle of Afghanistan, which is a landlocked country. No one's seen the sea. And they were projecting this thing on the wall of these whales and dolphins, interspersed with messages from the British commanders saying, "Oh, we've come to Afghanistan to help you," and then message from the local governor. The whole thing was. I can't imagine how anybody could think that this was something that would have some resonance or convince people that we were doing something useful in Helmand. And in fact, the military commander I was with, who'd been instructed to put it on and show them, actually turned it off after about 5 minutes and said, "This is really embarrassing." So clearly we were not explaining, maybe we didn't know what we were doing there. But if the main reason, which is different to Vietnam, but if the main reason was that it was for our own national security that we fought them there so as not to have them here, which seems to have been the biggest message, it's very hard to see how that was a success, because I don't think anybody would say that we are safer today than we were before the troops went into Afghanistan. I mean, you look at around the world, there's more insurgencies and wars going on than any time in the last 50 years. And I think it's instructive to look at Afghanistan because that was the biggest international intervention in 50 years. And we've subsequently gone on to a series of others, Iraq, Libya, and non-intervention Syria. And it feels like we just don't know how to end wars anymore.
Or start them, and perhaps that's the other comparison with Vietnam, with regards to Syria. When you see what's going on in Syria, do you think actually they've learnt the wrong lesson from Afghanistan there about not interfering?
Yes, because I don't think the lesson to learn from Afghanistan is to not intervene. I think it was right at the beginning, but it was what we did afterwards, and the problems were more political than military, I think.
Political at what level? I mean, because obviously, I mean, you knew an awful lot of generals and a lot of things going on amongst the military here and there. But you lay the blame at the politicians, the level of politicians.
More, because I think there was just like I said, it was no explanation of what we were trying to achieve. So I think it was very hard for the military to achieve anything if they didn't really know what it was we were trying to get. And if you think about what they were doing, they were trying to somehow get backing for an Afghan government which was very unpopular because it was involved in a lot of corruption and wasn't delivering services to people. So for British soldiers going into Helmand saying, we've come to help your government, and people there thinking, well, this government, all they do is demand bribes from us and cause us problems, is a very difficult sell.
Some more questions, yes. I'll keep an eye out for hands so that we can get the microphone onto you.
Roseshta Setna, I'm a journalist. I just wondered what you thought about women's rights in Afghanistan and how they've progressed over the last 10 years and more. Recently we had that young woman who was very brutally murdered, and it was women who carried her coffin. And, you know, there are women parliamentarians who are very outspoken. They've been attacked numerous times. Women like Fawzia Kofi, Shukriya Barakzai, etc. What will happen if, you know, security deteriorates even further? I mean, how in the world will women not only be protected, but, you know, the debate around legislation, etc., how will that work?
I'm glad you asked that. It's a really important question because, you know, it was one of the issues that we made as almost justification for going into Afghanistan at the time. This whole, you know, women's rights, and Bush, after the Taliban was toppled, in his State of the Union speech announced women of Afghanistan are now free, and it was sort of really one of the big things that they talked about a lot at the time. And it worries me a lot now, because the women, as you mentioned, that we have kind of lifted up and made role models and had international conferences and talked about as showing the progress of women in Afghanistan. Some of those women are now in hiding, are in terrible situations, feel that they've been by the West. The attack recently on Fakunda, the 27-year-old woman who was burnt and run over by a Toyota truck in the Kabul River last month. Now, the reaction to that, with the women carrying her, which is unheard of, was really inspiring, and there's, you know, a lot of protests around the country at what happened to her. But at the same time, the very fact that something like that could happen in the middle of the day in Kabul, just a mile from the presidential palace, is terrifying. And the people that carried out the attack were mostly young men. They weren't these sort of old Taliban-like people in villages. They were young men who posted on YouTube afterwards what they'd done, as though they were proud of it. And other people there just stood by and did nothing. There was a bizarre, yesterday I think, or the day before, reconstruction of her killing done by some activists to try and shame the government into actually doing something, because nobody had been charged. So now they have charged, I think, 49 different people for being involved. But, you know, Afghanistan remains a very dangerous place for women. There was a recent UN report last month saying 9 out of 10 women have suffered abuse. I think only 5% of cases people actually get punished. And there are just endless horrific stories. A lot of shelters you can go to around the country which are full of women who have fled abusive marriages, or hospitals where women have set fire to themselves because they're so desperate at what situation they're in. So, you know, it is really still a very, very difficult place to be a woman. And I think we had all these people come out and talk about gender awareness at the beginning, but people didn't think about the fact that you have to change the men's mindset as well, not just say to women, these are your rights and this is what you should be able to do.
Change that though. I mean, there's nothing from outside, is there?
Well, I mean, you could try, and we didn't do that. All these kind of discussions and things were all about telling women what rights are. Obviously, education, if you start from that, makes a lot of difference, and the way that maybe the younger generation will be. But that's what scares me about that attack, that those were young men, young urban men carrying out that attack.
Gentleman there.
Hi, sorry, Harry Thomas. From what I've read recently, it seems like Ghani is doing a lot more or attempting at least a lot more outreach with both India and Pakistan on a sort of strategic level. Can you offer a comment on that, particularly in relation to Karzai, and whether you thought Karzai was any good at that?
Yes, well, I kind of left myself open to that because I said I thought Karzai would make a good foreign minister. Yes, Ghani's in India at the moment. I think, relations had got so bad between Afghanistan and Pakistan under Karzai, and obviously Afghans are very angry at what Pakistan's been doing, but they need to have good relations if this is ever going to be resolved in any way. So I think it was right what he was doing, reaching out. I think a lot of people now feel it hasn't achieved anything, that all this talk and visits back and forth, but actually the relation has continued the same. As long as Pakistan feels insecure, that it's sort of abandoned by the outside, that India is its big enemy and it needs protection on its other border because of that, I think it's going to be very hard to really change things. So I think Karzai had just become so angry with everybody. It had become kind of impossible for people to deal with him, and he was accusing of murder, he was lashing out everybody. It just became a very untenable situation. And Ghani has come in and is trying to do lots of different things. But the problem with Ghani, he's impressive, he's a technocrat, he's full of energy, and he's going to change all these different things. But it is Afghanistan. You still have to do things the sort of Afghan way, and you can't just, like he said, I'm not going to reappoint any of the previous ministers or governors. Well, actually, some of those people are more powerful than you are, really, and so you can't just get rid of them.
Have you got your week with him yet? It's only a matter of time.
I'm going to see his wife.
Oh, really? There we go. It's the way to do it. Gentleman there.
Yeah, hi there. Will Birtles. Could you talk a little bit about Ahmed Shah Massoud and whether or not you feel he was the sort of the ray of light that Afghanistan needed or wanted, and just a bit about him?
Ahmed Shah Massoud was the Panjshiri, known as the Lion of the Panjshir, who was the one person, he was a commander against the Russians, but then he kept on fighting in the north of the Taliban. So when the Taliban took over Afghanistan, there was still about 10% that remained not under their control, and this was under control of Massoud, and he was a very inspirational leader. One of my regrets is when I lived in Peshawar and I used to go in and out with the Mujahideen, I never went to see Massoud, because it was interesting. If you travelled with the Pashtuns, you tended to then really accepted by the Tajiks, even though you were a journalist. And so I, from early on, had travelled with Pashtun commanders, so had not met Massoud. After 9/11, I subsequently got to know very well a lot of people who'd been close to him. And I'll never forget, actually, there was a documentary about him, a French documentary, that was shown on TV here, I think in 2002. And some of Massoud's commanders and his intelligence here in London, so I invited them to my house to come and watch this documentary. And I said to my husband, who's never been to Afghanistan, maybe they will bring some friends. I'd invited like 3 of them, so we should make plenty of food. Anyway, about 20 we were like just taking everything out of the fridge, any food. But I'll never forget, because they sat and watched this documentary with tears streaming down their eyes. They were so just passionate about him. He was clearly such a charismatic leader. And I do think it was a great loss for Afghanistan. He was killed the day before 9/11. Most people think that that was a kind of deal done by Al-Qaeda for the Taliban off, so that the Taliban would not hand them over to the Americans. And yeah, I think, you know, if he had survived, he would have been an important figure in the administration. The other person who was killed just after that in October 2001 was Abdul Haq, who was a Pashtun from Jalalabad area, who was a major commander, and he went in to try and raise a force against the Taliban and was betrayed, you think, by ISI and killed. And I think that was a huge loss for Afghanistan, because he was a very good and a very honest man, in my view, and I think would have been a really important leader for Afghanistan. So they did lose two crucial figures early on. And, you know, it's easy for me to say Karzai wasn't the right person, but it wasn't really obvious other person, actually.
Has your husband since been to Afghanistan?
He says he'll never go.
How does he feel every time you go?
Well, he knows I love it. So
have you asked him to go? Have you tried to persuade him?
Yes. I'm sure, I mean, my son's just 15. I'm sure he will go at some point. But my husband, no, he likes his comfort. He thinks I'm mad going.
And when your son goes, how will you feel about that?
Difficult. I look back now, you know, I was 21 when I went to Peshawar, and I was an
You had a pink rabbit in your bag, didn't you?
And I set off, and, you know, these were the days, there was no mobile phone or internet, and there was not even any direct dialing from Peshawar. So, you know, I rarely was able to call my mum, and I used to do things, I thought I was being very clever. Like, if I was going into Afghanistan, I didn't want her to know, and then I would be there because it was difficult, you were there for weeks. So she would guess that, because if I didn't phone for like a month or something. So I used to
What did she say? You've been to Afghanistan again? I mean,
I leave these postcards for people to post from Pakistan to her, but actually the post took weeks anyway. So they would, the idea was that she'd get them, because we used to write lots of letters. We didn't always talk on the phone, so she wouldn't realise. I realised how difficult that must have been for her, and of course feel very guilty.
Because you're anticipating it.
But, you know, I have to, just in my defence, have to say that you do all these kind of things that's supposedly dangerous, but I was researching an English woman in Brazil called Margaret Mee, who was an explorer in the Amazon, a painter. She painted flowers, and she went to places to paint flowers where nobody except Indians living in the Amazon had ever gone, and she was had all sorts of narrow escapes. She had hepatitis, malaria. She was kidnapped by garimperos, illegal gold miners. Her boat capsized. She was kidnapped by Indians. Survived all of these things. Was then awarded an MBE here in England. So came back for this and got run over in Leicester and killed. So it just shows. So I tell my mum this.
Sure, that makes her feel better. Some more. Yes, the gentleman over here. You say it's supposedly dangerous. I mean, they are dangerous, and that is part of the reason you do it, isn't it? I mean, it is the adrenaline rush and the kick and the.
Well, Afghanistan, I went back and forth to because, you know, I loved it. So when 9/11 happened and everything, I had to go back. No, I often wish these places weren't dangerous. But no, I'm not going to lie to you. No. It is addictive going and sort of being at places that are on the edge, and it is quite hard sometimes coming back to life here afterwards, and, you know, dealing with paying bills and getting mortgages and buying bathroom tiles. I don't know. It seems difficult to get very interested in that when you've been with people who are living kind of on the verge of death all the time.
Thank you. Paul Knott, I'm an ex-British diplomat turned writer. And I was just interested really to get your views, Christine, on after everything that's gone on through this long period of our involvement in Afghanistan, what now? What do you think are the most, if anything, useful things Britain in a government sense and the Western world perhaps could do to help Afghanistan?
Yeah, I think, first of all, you know, I'd be horrified if we just kind of forget about Afghanistan. It does worry me a bit. I mean, Britain does still have 500 troops there, and we are still giving 100 million a year, I think. But there's definitely a sense that the government wants to forget about it. I mean, they really didn't want people to go and cover the withdrawal last year. It was a big fight to actually be able to do that. They just hoped that people would sort of forget all about it. And I think it's very important that we shouldn't, not least as we were just talking about with the women, that, you know, we have left some people, lifted up hopes of people and then leaving people at tremendous risk. So I think that it's very important that we should stay involved, and we all talked a lot about how you shouldn't leave ungoverned spaces, and by abandoning Afghanistan last time, this is what happened. And so if we end up doing the same thing again, look at Libya. We helped topple Gaddafi, declared it a success and went away, and now it's chaos there. So, you know, if you're going to do these things, you have to see them through, I think. But you do have to talk much more to the people on the ground, I think, about what they actually need and listen to them.
Hi, yeah, Jane Kirkpatrick. You mentioned earlier the very high percentage of young people, the young population in Afghanistan. I'm particularly thinking of the 20 to 30-year-olds. I just wondered what your impression was of the level of optimism and political engagement and activity amongst that age group, what you think of that?
A lot of the people that voted for Ghani, the new president, were youth that saw him as somebody that was actually going to change things. The biggest issue for them is employment. You know, we built schools for people, primary schools, but we didn't really do anything about providing jobs for people. So you've got now a generation of actually educated people, but who have no jobs. So it's not very surprising if people then end up picking up a gun and going and fighting with the Taliban, because that's a way you can make money, or growing poppy. And I think that's one of the big failures, was to actually try and provide some alternatives for people. So now Ghani talks a lot about that. If he fails to do that, I think very disillusioned, and it is dangerous, because you do have this big youth who are mostly unemployed at the moment.
But the question was a sort of optimism. I mean,
Yes.
they voted for Ghani. Do you get the sense, despite the difficulties and the lack of employment, that there is
I think it's mixed. You know, they do see that things have changed, and that they saw Ghani as a sort of figure of hope that could latch onto. If he doesn't deliver things, I think that optimism will disappear. It was a sort of very guarded optimism, if you like, and it depended also where you were. You'd see quite different views in Kabul than you would see in the south and east, where there was much more violence.
Right. Any more questions?
I'll ask one.
Yeah, go on, Millicent.
You talked a little bit there about the difficulty of covering the drawdown. I wondered if you could talk about the kind of track record of journalists over the past decade and a half, how they've done in covering the conflict. Embedding was kind of largely what journalists did at the beginning, and how that affected the picture that we have back in the UK and in the US.
Yeah. Well, it's
How
changed
did you
a
find
lot.
embedding? I often wondered that, because I mean, you were very critical at times.
Yes, prefer, well, it depends. Okay, so during the war in Iraq, I didn't think that we should, so I was one of the so-called unilaterals that kind of wandered around, which actually turned out to be quite difficult because we didn't have information of what was going on, where the front line was, and sort of critical things like that. So actually, I think the best stuff during the beginning part of the war in Iraq was people that were embedded, but then also some of them got completely fooled by propaganda from the Americans, and that's the danger, because you're not getting any sort of outside information. Ideally, is you do both. You can go to places on your own and also with the military and see both sides. Problem is now in a lot of places it's become so dangerous that the only way to go is embedded, and that's not very satisfactory, because then how can you think you're really getting any sense of what people feel if any time you go and see them you're going in some armoured Humvee and speaking to them with lots of people with guns around you.
I mean, it's a difficult question for you, I can appreciate, but I think the question was particularly what you thought of the record of British journalists on Afghanistan as well as Iraq.
I think, there's been some good reporting over I can't think of anything in Afghanistan where people it's different to Iraq. Iraq, there are a lot of examples where people were really fooled by propaganda. There's not the same.
And what about the British military, the way they handle journalists who are embedded?
Well, I'm already in trouble with the military. As you know, that to go and be in embed with the British military, you have to sign something called the Green Book, which means that everything you write or photograph or film has to be seen by them and approved. It comes out here, and nobody, and I get quite angry about this, none of us write when we do our reports, or when TV reports come, nobody says this was done under conditions of what is basically censorship. And yet if we go to Iran or somewhere and mind as we do.
Sorry, we do as broadcasting then. Maybe you don't.
We don't. And actually, I don't think that's true. Sorry,
we do at the BBC. We have to.
TV reports from not say at the end this was done under.
In the introduction, they always say. At least that's the rule book.
Because I argued very strongly that I thought we should all say that, and nobody was supporting, and it's very difficult to
do it on your own.
Other people. Because people felt that they wouldn't get embeds if they objected to the system. And so there was, sadly, no support to stand up against the system. And no other country in the world does this. No other. If you go with the Americans, they treat you like grown-ups and tell you what if you are privy to some sensitive information, they tell you not to report that. But they do not see your copy or your film before it goes out, and I don't think it's correct, and I am amazed that the British military have got away with this for all this time.
I'm sorry to ask you to guess, there's just no way that you can calculate it, but in all the years that you've covered Afghanistan, from the first time you were there to now, how much do you think financially the West has spent on dealing with Afghanistan?
The figure a sort of ballpark figure that's used for this last war from 2001 to now is about $1 trillion. So a lot of money. If you just look at dealing with the narcotics, the US spent $7 billion on basically massively increasing the opium production. A huge amount of money was spent. Most of that trillion was on the military presence, because the US, at one point there was 140,000 troops there. and each troop was costing, what was it, $1 million a year to be there. So it's a lot of money.
The lady here, and then we're just a couple more minutes.
Hi, I'd just like to know, earlier you said that you thought the Taliban would remain active, wouldn't come back and threaten the government. Why do you think they wouldn't do that?
Well, I don't think they would take Kabul, because Kabul is quite difficult to take. It's in a sort of nest of hills, mountains, and it only has 4 main roads in, so you can protect the entrance. There's this supposed ring of steel around Kabul to stop suicide bombers and things getting in there. That is not that effective. But so, like during the Russian times, the Mujahideen hardly managed to do any attacks in Kabul. Kabul was pretty much intact at the end of that war. So I think it would be very difficult for the Taliban to try and mount that kind of attack. And there would be some kind of, certainly at the moment, some kind of Western response. But in the rest of the country, no, I think we more or less seem to have just accepted that they will take back different bits of the country, and that's how it will be.
Can I ask you, it's so, I mean, to listen to you, you have a very gentle way of talking and you laugh a lot, and then you have this sort of devastating critique about just almost everything. And I was just thinking that sort of, you know, when one asks what was achieved, you point to mobile phones. I'm struggling to think what else you've pointed to. But do you...
The system is improved.
The health system and education, I suppose. So there are... Do you think the lessons, because a lot of, you know, the ground has been gone over, lots of conversation. Do you think, will we only know if the lessons have been learned when there is another military intervention somewhere? I mean, is that the nature of it?
What frustrates me, I think, about this is that people often now so public are fed up with intervening. There's no public appetite to intervene in a place. This was used as an excuse for Syria. I'm not sure that's true. I think people want to know why we're going. They want political leadership to explain what the objective is. You know, that's what we didn't do in Afghanistan. That's what we should learn from this. And if they explained and had some kind of convincing reason why we are doing what we're doing, then people, I think, would support. I think most people feel horrified that we did nothing in Syria and all these hundreds of thousands of people have been killed and it's all continuing. And I don't think that people think that was a good outcome.
And as for Afghanistan, you will continue to keep going back because you love it.
Yeah, I will, and I don't think that, you know, we should forget about it. It's going to be harder because I see that the media is already losing interest. It's quite hard for me to convince my...
Do you pitch stories and the editor says what?
The world has moved on.
Really?
Yes.
Your editor says the world has moved on.
I am going in June to do some stories, but there were some a few months ago where I was talking about, and I was told, I mean, look, we have a limited number of correspondents. Look at all the things going on in the world at the moment. Yemen, Libya, now we have the Nepal earthquake, the Mediterranean migrants, Iraq, Syria. There was a time when it was just Afghanistan.
When I bumped into you outside, you were on your phone to your editor who was asking you to go to Kathmandu. Are you going to go?
Actually not, but for other reasons.
Ladies and gentlemen, Christina Lamb.